Welcome to this session 3 of our course, What, So What, Now What? And tonight, and today in this session, we're making our way through from really the end of Wesley's life through to 1932, so 1791 to 1932, a huge area of history in terms of Methodism, but one that has a number of things that are worth mentioning because they help shape who we are today. So I'll start here with a hymn from Andrew Pratt. Best of all is God is with us. God will hold and never fail. Keep that truth when storms are raging. God remains, though faith is frail. Best of all is God is with us. These are the words that are reputed to have been said, allegedly said by Wesley on his deathbed. Best of all is God is with us. We don't know if that actually happened. Another contemporary writer suggests that it was an Isaac Watts hymn that was quoted. I'll praise my Maker while I've breath, and when my voice is lost in death, praise shall employ my nobler powers. My days of praise shall ne'er be past, while life and thought and being last of or immortality endures. Wesley's death is a crucial moment in the story of Methodism. In 1784, Wesley had said, I believe I shall not depart from the Church of England until my soul departs from my body. And indeed, in 87, he said, when the Methodists leave the church, God will leave them. It sounds like he was loyal to the end to the Church of England, even though he received a lot of criticism from within the Church of England. Remember last time we talked about the reasonable enthusiast. Enthusiasm was considered to be emotionalism and considered to be something that was quite dangerous. He was criticized for being disloyal to the Anglican Church. He was called a schismatic, somebody who was causing schism within the life of the church. And indeed, some even went so far as to call him a heretic. It certainly was becoming more and more difficult to remain. The Methodists had started to build their own chapels, and indeed the 1784 Deed of Declaration indicated a sign that they were going to be in a place where they could have their own chapels and they could have their own associational organisation and structure. Therefore, if they did become a separate organisation, they had the structure in place. Interestingly, Fletcher of Madeley, who I think we mentioned last week, and his brother Charles, were people he had perhaps at one stage, John had perhaps thought at one stage, would succeed him. But unfortunately, both men died before he did, so that kind of destroyed that idea. So he had no natural successor that he could see passing the work on to. And this gave Methodism, this deed of declaration gave Methodism an independent legal status. And it also created the constitution of the Legal 100, the Legal 100. This was effectively the conference. It was 100 preachers, mainly ordained folks, who were in association with Wesley, who became the organising body, the trust body, after he died. Now that's interesting in itself, because here we go from an organisation of around about 75,000 people on his death who are in connection, the Methodist people who are in connection with one person, John Wesley. He oversees the whole lot. It's a very focused, personal form of what theologians called episcopae, or oversight. But after his death, there's no natural successor, and they move from one person, not to 12, but to 100 people. And so we now have this legal body. So it often comes down to this question today. This is the what and now what and so what. Today we have not one person, but we have a one person in the president or the general secretary secretary of conference who holds the work in between conferences. The president is an annual appointment, and a vice president, a lay person always, or a deacon. They are people who serve for 1 year. So we are very reticent since Mr. Wesley and his benevolent autocracy. We're very reticent to have one single person in power. Although there are calls for that from time to time. And we'll see why in a few moments. But the conference, it is the single focused episcopacy of the president for a year, and the conference, this corporate body. At district level, it is the chair, this focused person, and the synod or the district leadership team. And then at circuit level, there's the superintendent, a single person, and the corporate group of the circuit meeting. And a local church, who's in charge? The minister with the personal focused episcopacy, and also the corporate episcopacy or oversight of the church council. So it's always a both and situation in terms of our leadership. We're very reticent to make it all committee, but we need some focused episcopacy, but no longer do we want to have one single person like Mr. Wesley looking after the whole thing. Now, the other thing that led, not just the deed of declaration, sort of created it created the environment in which indeed separation could happen, but another thing happened that kind of made it even more inevitable, and that was the ordinations of Coke and Asbury in 1784. They were appointed as joint superintendents of the American work in the post-war of independence period in North America. If you like, in the War of Independence, Americans basically said, we no longer want to be under the monarch, and with the monarch came the Anglican Church. And so the Anglican Church was reticent to make a provision of bishops and of ordained folks to go into America, given that the relationship had broken down. Mr. Wesley asked for that, but when they wouldn't give it with a little bit of theological light-footedness, Mr. Wesley argued that he himself could ordain the workers, Coke and Asbury, to go and do that. That was a kind of a double-edged sword, because as soon as he had done it, Coke and Asbury arrived in America and said, hang on a moment, this won't, the British system of circuits and circuit superintendents won't work, because the geography is so big. So what we're going to do instead is have bishops. So that's why we have in America and in Methodism around the world that was started by American Methodists, we have bishops. But in England and those churches which were planted by British Methodists, we have superintendents, chairs, and presidents. You see why that happened? So that goes back to them. But the main thing here is that it led to a situation where it was inevitable that there was going to be a breaking down of the relationship with the Anglican Church. At the same time as sending off Coke and Asbury, Wesley sent them off with his sermons, and he also sent them off with a library that he'd created that said, this is what you need to have for your preachers who you'll train in that place. And he took the 39 articles of Anglicanism and he reduced them to 24. So he was basically laying the land for an eventual separation, even though he himself said, look, I'm dying as an Anglican. In fact, when he died in 1791, while separation was more or less inevitable, he said, I live and I die in the Church of England. But then he was buried at his own request in his own chapel, Wesley's Chapel in London. He did it at 5 o'clock in the morning. Apparently he was carried by poor people. He wanted to make that clear that he was one of the people. Very simple funeral, 5 o'clock in the morning he wanted, and yet thousands turned up. He was trying to avoid a spectacle. He just wanted to go into glory without much of a fuss. But of course, you've got 75,000 people over the country, Methodist members and others influenced by him, who wanted to mark this moment. Well, no sooner had he died, but 1793, 2 years later, Methodist ministers were to be ordained by being received by the conference into full connection. They didn't lay on the hands at this stage, and yet that restriction was reversed in 1836. But in 1793, they started doing their own ordinations, and the same year, Methodist preachers were given the ability to administer the sacrament. Remember last week we said up to that point, Mr. Wesley said, no, you meet in your society, you meet in your band, you meet in your class, but then you go to the Church of England and you receive the sacrament. And those were all part of the Methodist package. But at this stage, the conference, 2 years after his death, agreed to ordination and agreed to the sacraments being offered by the Methodist preachers. So that more or less leads to a place where they can separate fully. So by 1785, separation was in the process, and it was no longer something that could be avoided. Now, Barry Tabraham says, he's one of the authors of a recent book called Methodism in the Making, says, far from reviving the Church of England, it gradually became a distinct and separate denomination. Was that a good thing? Was that a bad thing in the long term? You could debate that until the cows come home. It clearly has led to a significant body of Christian people all over the world. Figures differ from book to book, but we're looking at something like 75, 80 million people around the world today who call themselves Methodists and link themselves to Mr. Wesley's ministry. But beyond that, you've got the Salvation Army that came out of Methodism. Beyond that, you've got the holiness movement that led to Pentecostalism and the charismatic movement. Some commentators have, Billy Abraham, writing his book on Methodism, suggests that up to a quarter of Christians in the world today can trace their historical DNA, their spiritual DNA, back to Mr. Wesley. Significant person. So Methodism grew exponentially over the next half century all over the world. But at home here in Britain, it was a time of trouble. At his death, 72,500 Methodists in the connection with Mr. Wesley. Led now by an annual conference with a connectional organisation of work, a reasonably fixed standard of doctrines, and basically able to be a separate denomination. But there were three areas that caused them some difficulties and controversies. One was leadership. Wesley's death created a power vacuum, and there was plenty of people ready to jump into that space. No one wanted another benevolent autocrat, hence the Legal 100. And very early on, within 3 years, calls for the conference to do what the Americans had done and create their own bishops. Something they rejected and have rejected consistently when it keeps rearing its head every couple of years since then. The country was divided up into geographical districts under people called presidents, who would later become chairs of district, which we have to this day. And so the pattern for future development had been set by Mr. Wesley and developed in those first years after his death, but remained to be an area of controversy, particularly around the area of the ordained and the lay, or the preachers and the laity. Remember, conference under Mr. Wesley was made up of ordained preachers, and they set the doctrines and they set the policy of the church. In a sense, they were what you'd call a bounded set. And outside of that bounded set of people who were making decisions, people felt they had no power. As early as 1791, the year of his death, 50 Cornish preachers proposed that the Legal 100 be abolished and that circuits and societies be given their own authority, much more by lay people. That was rejected, of course. Interestingly, in historical terms, there was a similar debate going on across the nation about whether power is held locally or nationally by a monarch and his government. What we have today in terms of representation from local districts right up to the national parliament is something that was created in the Great Reform Act of 1832. So there was a national conversation going on about where power lies and how decisions are made, what we call in sociological terms polity. That was happening in the church as well as in society. There was also the question of Methodists and their relationship with the Anglican Church. There was a great difference and contradictory convictions, as we'd call them nowadays, about how to relate to the Church of England. Very early on, there were some people called Church Methodists who were very like Wesley's own position that it was okay having these societies, these holy groups that were renewal groups, but really we were Anglicans at the end of the day. So we called them Church Methodists, and they hoped very early on for reunion. But something that, there was, and there continues to be in Methodism, a kind of trying to hold to a middle ground. And so on one side, you would have those who want to get back to the Church of England. There still are those today. And on the other side, those who feel we're not far enough away. We need to be much more radical and cut free and able to be ourselves. Those tensions have continued right through to today. Probably one of the nails in the coffin, as it were, that made it absolutely impossible to come back was another Anglican renewal movement, which was the Oxford movement of the 1830s and 1840s, where what we now call the High Church reform and renewal was happening. People like John Henry Newman, Edward Pusey, John Cable, they had a great emphasis on dignity, on ceremony, on right ritual and right liturgy. And that led to tensions within the Anglican Church, and it certainly widened the gap with Methodists. In fact, just in a seminar I was part of the other day, it was said there that Methodists really got into educating children in a big way in the 1830s and 40s because they didn't like the popish tendencies of the existing church schools from the Anglican Church. So they got into it, a kind of a competition thing, because they didn't like that theology. But here, the main thing about the 1800s is the splits within Methodism itself. And we have to understand the historical context in which these splits took place. In Britain, you've had the American Revolution, which sent shockwaves. In France, you've had the Revolution, sent shockwaves. And really, Britain's in a place of fear. Will we have a revolution as well? We're not the same place as we were back 100 years when Wesley was born and started his life and work. When we were moving from being a rural to an urban society, we're now well and truly in urban cities all around the country, in big towns, and agriculture and industry and everything, much greater population, and really the structures of government and of life haven't developed as quickly as the population. So there's a lot of dissatisfaction. And the government were concerned about Methodism because Methodism was a grassroots level organisation that gathered people and organised them and did what we'd call today community organising. And yes, people had left Methodism already for other reasons, like Whitfield's and his Calvinism, or because people wanted to go back to the Anglican Church, or because we weren't radical enough. As I say, if you hold a middle sort of conciliatory world where you can live with paradox, it isn't always a popular place. People will feel you're being wishy-washy and you're not holding to anything. But actually sometimes you have to hold that middle ground. In Methodism, part of our DNA is that we do that and do it well sometimes. So you had splits within Methodism itself. First one was from the Methodist New Connection in 1791. Though Mr. Wesley wasn't even cold in the grave, as it were, and somebody called Alexander Killam from Epworth, his home community. He didn't like the centralised power of the legal 100. He felt now we've got rid of this oligarch, this benevolent autocrat in Mr. Wesley. Come on, can we not make our own decisions locally? Why do you have to make all the decisions at a national level? Can we not make some of the decisions at least locally? And of course, Conference pushed back against that, and so he created the Methodist New Connection. Interestingly, when you come to the now what, so what stage, a lot of what Alexander Killam was looking for is part of modern Methodism, where the circuit is at the centre, where a lot of decisions are made locally, supported by the wider church, but really the circuit is much more at the centre of our organisation than it was when Mr. Wesley died and what Alexander Killam was looking for. Interestingly, that the Methodist New Connection did quite well across the north of England, particularly Midlands and north of England, through much of the early 1800s, and only started to see decline in after 1851, and by 1907 they were ready to join up again. And there were a number of churches that we'll see came back together in an amalgamation in 1907 when the United Methodist Church in Great Britain was created. There's another group at this time called the Independent Methodists, 1806. This really started with some cottage meetings over in Warrington in around about 1796. They were called Quaker Methodists because they adopted a lot of Quaker customs. The first conference was in 1806 in Macclesfield, and independence, they called themselves the Independent Methodists. Independence in the sense of the local church having a kind of congregational structure and able to make their own decisions locally. See, it's all about where power lies and who can make decisions. They still survive in parts of England, in Bristol, in the Northwest, and in fact, since the God and Love Unites Us decisions of a couple of years ago, some of our ministers and members have gone into the Independent Methodists. But probably the biggest one worth mentioning is the Primitive Methodists in 1809, founded by Hugh Bourne and William Clowes from the Stoke, Burslem area. They'd been influenced by someone called Lorenzo Dow, who'd come over from America and brought with him something that was part of North American evangelicalism, and that was called the camp meetings. And the camp meetings were basically day-long gatherings in an open space on a hillside, and really getting back to the field preaching. It's worthwhile spending some time looking at that another time. We haven't got time in this session today. But the first one was held in 1807 at Mow Cop over near Stoke. And unfortunately, the powers that be in the wider Wesleyan church were a bit nervous about this, to say the least. Why? Well, because the government were nervous about it. These big open-air gatherings could become seditious and risk revolution. So Bourne and Clowes found themselves expelled because the camp meetings were deemed as highly improper and likely to be of considerable mischief. The main body thereafter was known as the Wesleyans. They wanted freedom. The primitives wanted freedom to express their faith, their worship, their social engagement, their evangelism in bold and brassy ways. We get from them the phrase the ravers and the ranters, or the ranters and ravers. And the emphasis was very much on lay people and on women preachers. And lay and ordained came to their conference with representatives from every circuit. And again, that's had a big influence on what we have today. A church that, when we meet at conference in a few weeks' time, we will have equal number of lay and ordained people representing every part of the connection. A much more representative body. and much more of a grassroots feel to it, even though there were a number of artisans and skilled workers, etc., who were in the primitive movement as well. So primitive Methodism is big, and it's, becomes quite typical to go to many communities around England today and find a Wesleyan chapel, and not too far away from it, a primitive chapel, and perhaps one of the other Methodist traditions as well. So the Primitive Methodists went to be quite big, and they had influence on all kinds of things, and social engagement, on political life, the creation of the trade unions, the healthcare, education, the Labour Party, all manner of things that they were involved in. Overseas mission as well as home mission, very evangelistic at heart. So that's the primitives, and I could spend a whole night just talking about the primitives, but I'll move myself on to the Bible Christians in 1815. Again, there was a desire for some freedom, mainly in the southwest, the Cornish Peninsula, started by someone called William O'Brien, who had been rejected from the Wesleyan ministry on 2 occasions when he candidated. So he basically said, well, if they're not going to let me be a minister, I'll start my own denomination. So he did. And it was very like the parent body, and they worked very well together. And typically the Bible Christians worked in parts of Cornwall where the Wesleyan Church or the Primitives weren't working. And so weren't in competition and were very like the parent body. And then there was the United Methodist Free Churches, who began their life around about 1857. And that was really a gathering of a number of smaller groups who had been created earlier in the century. I'll just mention a few of them. 1827, the Protestant Methodists, what a great title, the Protestant Methodists. That really started because of the organ dispute. That was in Leeds when the trustees, the rich trustees of Brunswick Chapel put an organ into the building, and the organ was deemed to be in those days a worldly instrument that would only lead to bad things. How true were they? Never mind. But they were having difficulty getting an organ into church without causing a split. Nowadays, you can't get rid of the things without causing a split. So the Protestant Methodists, 1827, the Arminian Methodists, 1831, over in Manchester, the Wesleyan Reformed, who continue to be a denomination in their own right, 1849. Ultimately, as I say, a whole load of smaller groups coming back together in 1907. And only later in 1932, this key date, 1932, the Deed of Union, when not only the United, but the Wesleyan and the Primitives, a couple of other strands, come back together to create what we now know as the Methodist Church in Britain. Only the Wesley Reformed and the Independent Methodists remained as significant separate denominations. One group we didn't talk about, two groups we didn't talk about. One was the Salvation Army. Salvation Army began the Booths, were Methodists. He was a Methodist superintendent, and again, just found himself falling out with the powers that be in the Wesleyan Church, and created this really a missionary organisation at home here in England that have gone on to be a significant denomination, not just here in England, but all over the world. Fantastic group of people in the Salvation Army. And then just finally to mention the organisation has been there right from Wesley's death, the Wesleyan Methodist Church. And while Wesley couldn't identify a significant successor for himself, nevertheless there was a significant successor in that first sort of 30 or 40 years after his death. And his name was Jabez Bunting. And he managed to hold the Wesleyan Church together, quite a conservative body, quite a dignified, trying to show that they were a real ecclesial body with a lot of dignity and gravitas throughout those early years, in the first 50 years after Wesley's death. In a sense, that tension between the Methodist Church being a proper denomination and with proper dignitaries and all the trappings that you would expect of a grown-up institution, religious institution like the Anglican Church or the Catholic Church. There's always been a Wesleyan streak in Methodism. And at the same time, there's always been that kind of a radical, let's do what God's calling us to do sort of group that would lean more towards the primitive side of things. And those two are always held in tension in Methodism right down to this day. Folks, a lot of information today to share with you, right from Mr. Wesley's death through to 1932. And I've been speaking for nearly half an hour. I apologise. There was just too much to get into one session tonight. Next time, we're going to be looking at what happens not just in England, but after Wesley, what happens in America and how does Methodism grow around the rest of the world. So that's next time. And that'll be in 2 weeks' time. Okay, but as we go into this weekend ahead of us, this is the celebration of Aldersgate on Sunday, and it coincides with the celebration of Pentecost. So that's an interesting conversation for us to have on Sunday in our churches. So God bless, and I will see you next time in session 4.